Thresholds are used to create a record of notable events occurring within your network. When a defined threshold is breached, an event record is created. You can report on those event records, and you can configure alerts to trigger in response to those event records. Statseeker allows you to configure thresholds against every metric: raw and calculated values, averages, standard deviations, percentiles or rates of change, that kind of thing. And you can also threshold against interpretive values such as anomaly strength or even predicted data using trend lines and forecast data. Now, the scope mentioned there covers a fair amount of ground, but you may have noticed an omission, and that's state changes such as device up-down events and interface opera status changes. State changes automatically create event records for reporting and alerting purposes. There's no need to configure anything for them. The Statseeker thresholds look after everything else, all of your time series data. I'm not going to go into the alerting side of things here. In this video, I'm just going to focus on threshold creation and reporting on your thresholds. Let's jump straight in. To configure thresholds, we head to the admin tool, alerting and event management, threshold config, and add a new threshold. Start by giving it a name. I'm going to set a threshold for outbound traffic utilizing greater than 90% of the link for at least 10 minutes. Attribute is the entity type and metric that I want a threshold against. And we can see here that the entity list contains all the entity types that this particular server is configured to monitor. The content of your list may differ depending on what version server you're running and what CDT packages you've got installed. So interface, TX util. Format, I want the average outbound util over the 10 minutes, and I'll get back to interval in just a moment. Let's move on to the conditions that will trigger a breach. Condition is above what? 90. Interface utilization is measured in percent, so this value is 90%. If we were looking at traffic speeds, they'd be measured in bits per second. Looking at traffic counts, it'd be bytes or packets, depending on the metric. Generally, it's in the attribute name. If you aren't sure, create a simple custom report and have a look. Let me show you. Reports, edit, new report. I'll give it a name, make it a tabular report on interfaces. Now, a field that comes to mind is an attribute that we might not threshold against, but you may want to filter a threshold by, and that's interface speed. So field is speed. I'll copy that field and change the configuration to show the raw value. And before I run, rather than asking the server to return speeds for every interface on my network, I'll just quickly drop in a device filter. And view. So we can see that I'm monitoring 3 interfaces on that router. And here's the speed that we would typically see in a report or a dashboard. But here where we specify the raw value, we see that when Statseeker asks an interface for its speed, the value is returned in bits per second. And Statseeker just makes it a little more readable. So if you aren't sure, specify the raw value in the custom report and have a quick look. Okay, let's get back to our threshold. So, average outbound utilization above 90%. Now, interval. The interval is how often the threshold is assessed. And an interval without an accompanying time filter acts as both the interval and the time filter. We have an interval of 1 minute, so every minute we'll check the last 1 minute's worth of data and see if the average util was over 90%. But I'm looking for sustained bursts of outbound traffic. I want a 10-minute average over 90, so interval is 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes, check the average outbound utilization for the previous 10. But if a burst starts halfway through one interval and ends halfway through the next, I'll miss it. So I need a rolling average. I need both the interval, check the threshold every minute, and a time filter. Data range, last 10 minutes. Every minute, check the average outbound utilization for the previous 10 minutes, and if it's above 90%, record an event. This is what I'm after. The trigger option here lets me manage how events are recorded in response to a breached threshold. The only on transmission option records an event when the threshold is breached and then another when it leaves the breached state. The option while in breach will record a new event and potentially trigger a new alert every time the threshold is assessed and found to be in a breach state. For our example, we're assessing the threshold every minute. If an interface is found to be in breach of the threshold, we record an event. A minute later, the threshold is assessed again. If the threshold is still breached, record a new event, and again a minute later. If there was an alert hanging off this threshold, we'll be getting a new alert every minute that the interface remained in a breach of the threshold. So assign while in breach wisely. I'll come back to device aggregation in a couple of other examples in just a moment. Now, time filter. Well, we've seen that when it's supplied, it specifies the range of data used to calculate the metric that's assessed by the threshold. The last 10 minutes. We've also got hours, days, and months. And we've also got options for day, week, and month so far, as well as the option to utilize the advanced time filter editor and customize the time filter as needed. On to attribute filters. These use configuration data to filter the targets of the threshold. We're looking at interface data so we can set a filter against any interface configuration data. And because an interface resides on a device, we also have access to device configuration fields. So device location is London. Now it's a regex, so London or Paris. And here, we're only looking at interfaces on devices in either of those locations. I can add an additional filter. Let's go with an interface attribute. And we'll use speed, and we know that from that test report we ran earlier, that speed is specified in bits. So if I want to restrict the threshold to just the gigabit interfaces on devices in those locations, I use this. And we can also apply entity filters. I can use interface to select specific interfaces or specific devices. Or I can use my groups, such as routers or WAN links. And when you're happy with your threshold, save it. I'll do another quick example, and we can have a look at the custom time filter a little bit. So new threshold. Let's say we have a metered connection to a remote office, and I want an alert when that connection has burned through a terabyte. So interface, total bytes, check it once a day, specify a terabyte, and the gateway for all traffic out of the office that I'm going to be targeting is the Chicago router interface GI01. So an entity filter to cover that one. Now, let's say the metered connection gets data renewed on the 25th of the month. So a time filter is range, ***25, midnight to now. Now, if you aren't sure, use the test facility in the advanced time filter editor. And I can see in the results that I have from the previous instance of the 25th, which was last month, to now. Everything's the way I want it, and we save that one. Okay, so the setting we skipped previously was aggregation. A use case might be CPU load. I'm interested when a device is under load, not when a single CPU on the device is under load. New threshold, server CPU, 95%, attribute, entity type is CPU, and the attribute is CPU load. Set my interval, a value of 95, a group filter. Now, as it is, if any CPU on a server tops 95% average load across 2 minutes, it'll record an event. If we set device aggregation format to average, it'll require the average load across all CPUs on any single device to be greater than 90 before that is triggered. So you can use device aggregation to aggregate across all instances of the entity that you're looking at on a single device. That can be CPUs or interfaces, whatever you need. Now, typically you'll be creating thresholds in order to trigger alerts. And as we just saw, you can apply filters to your threshold configuration to target groups, specific devices, or specific entities. This temperature sensor or that file system. You can get as granular as you like. But you can also leave your thresholds totally open, network-wide, and instead hang any number of target alerts off a single threshold. the outbound utilization threshold that we have here. I can configure an alert that only triggers when an interface in a remote office breaches that threshold, and the alert is sent to the engineer that is responsible for that office, and then create a separate alert hanging off the same threshold targeting another office, which is then sent to a different engineer. You can filter at the threshold or the alert level or both, whatever's going to work for you. Now, the last thing I want to cover is reporting on your thresholds. We always suggest that you baseline your network with regard to thresholds, and once you're confident that your threshold levels are where you want them, then go and anchor your alerts. To do that, you can configure your thresholds, let them run for a while, and then run reports against them to see instances of threshold breaches. Are my thresholds too low or too high to capture the behavior that I want to be alerted to? Let's have a look at my threshold reports. In the console, thresholds, and here we have our 3 linked reports. These are our stock reports available on all Statseeker servers, but you can always create your own custom reports on anything, including event records, in the reporting section. There's a lot of documentation and a heap of videos. Check it all out if you're new to customizing reports. So, the first report, the threshold summary. This report details the currently configured threshold. What is it called? What is it thresholding against? And we can see here that my ping threshold is called ping 250, but the threshold value is actually 200 milliseconds. And is it turned on? Drilling down from the threshold name will open that second report, the threshold report, filtering it to the selected threshold. We can see the devices that this threshold applies to. In this case, it's just the Barcelona office, and the number of breaches for each of those devices. And we don't have any today, so I'll just push the reporting period out to the last 60 days. And there we have a few breaches. Drilling down from a breach count will fire up that third report. It'll present all of the event records associated with that threshold on that device in that reporting period. Now we can see lots of records, but the majority are the ping time transitioning from below the threshold to an unknown state and then back again. The unknown state indicates that connectivity to the device was lost, so Statseeker wasn't able to retrieve the ping time. But I can sort that column or filter the report to get me just the breaches. I can see the breached value, the time since the previous threshold state change, and I can drop in a note against the record if needed. Configure your thresholds, monitor them through the reports, and adjust as needed. If you do amend a threshold configuration, the event record history for the old config is deleted, so you aren't seeing event records against the new config that only applied to the old values. If you want to keep the history, disable the old config, duplicate it, and make your changes on the new one. And that's a quick overview of threshold configuration and monitoring.